Okay, so let's begin. So we're doing Doc 28, the Virginia Resolutions on the Stamp Act, 1765. So for the new people here, how I break down what you should look for in a primary document is through these things. So you want to look at context, and I split context into two aspects. You have the who, what, when, where. I also included source because the source is important, and also on the quizzes, Professor Ingram likes to use the source that comes in. For example, the Pennsylvania Gazette, that was a source in relation to it. So I wanted to include that in this, so it's like you can understand where this document is coming from, but then you also get the who, why, or what, like the topic, and then when, where, stuff like that. And then we do historical context. It is sort of what is going on during this time or around this time to help build your historical knowledge of the document itself, so you guys know what to look for, how you can relate it to other things, stuff like that. This is mainly for your primary module assignment. You'll see a lot of this and how to include in that. Audience, kind of self-explanatory. Who is the document writing to? Who the person is writing to, or what the document is writing to. As this one is more of legislation, so we're going to see that. Lens. This is more of a categorical theme in history. So what in this document, how can you put this document into a theme? So social, political, economical, ethical, we came up one time, geographical, right? These different themes, think of it like that. And then also you use this lens as a perspective to okay, if I have something social, what's a question that I can have that can relate this document to the society of the time, right? So you can get the bigger picture of things. And then for argument, it's why is this document being written, right? Why is it important? Why is it being talked like this? Who is talking like this? Things like that. Of course, I'll break it down more when we get there. But so now, actually beginning, what is the source of this document?
The Journal of the House of Burgesses of Virginia.
How many of you know what that?
Yeah.
How many of you know what a House of Burgess is? Nobody? Okay, so the House of Burgess was the first form of colonial government. It was their general assembly. I know Professor Ingram talked about a general assembly earlier in one of the classes, but essentially think of it as the colony's parliament, right? So it's their body of government. It's how they can make laws, it's how they can govern themselves, but it's before the time of the Articles of Confederation. So they still don't have a structure of laws. They're coming up with that process. And this is the first major colonial government that we see. It was in Jamestown, hence why I put Jamestown up here, and also Virginia. You can associate that because Virginia, okay, major colony there, Jamestown, right? Okay, so who wrote this document?
John Pendleton Kennedy. Do you need how to spell that?
No, I got it. I'm just gonna put John Kennedy.
Okay.
And what assumptions can you make about John Kennedy from this article? Because in the context section of VOF, they don't give you a description of who he is. So what can you assume by just reading the document?
Well educated.
Educated, right? We have educated. What else? What does being educated mean? What can he do because of his education?
He's a politician. To be specific over.
What was the last part?
To be specific over a politician.
A word politician?
W-H-I-G.
Whig doesn't come until after the Constitution, but that's the 1800s. So he may be one later, but Whig does not exist at this time. So once we move later in times, you'll start seeing political parties arise. And you can start seeing them a little bit, especially in document 29 when we get to Brutus. You'll see sort of the formation of the first real political parties, but I don't want to get ahead of myself there. Alright, so we have politician, educated, but what else? How can, like, who are the most likely to be politicians?
Rich.
Okay, so we have wealthy. So by that, we can assume that it's mainly gonna be men who are there, right? It's mainly gonna be people who that own land, people who have status in the colonies. Also, it could be a lawyer, right? Because they have to study the laws, they're making laws. So just like that, so like break down who he is and things like that. Think of in the bigger picture of things, right?
He is a lawyer.
Well, yeah, there you go, right? So we have that he is so politician, lawyer, right? So think of that. So like, especially in one of those questions where Professor Ingram's asked about a specific person, you'll be like, all right, if he says who was a lawyer that who was a lawyer that made resolutions in the Jamestown colonial government, you'd be like, oh, lawyer, John Kennedy, right? So just, that may not be an exact question, but start thinking like that. That's the process you want to think, because you know the type of questions he asks, and these are things you want to look for in the document. Okay, so what, and by what I mean, what is the topic of this argument, or of this document, the argument, things like that?
Stand back to 1765.
More bigger picture. Think of how that Stamp Act is affecting them.
Taxation
Virginia's response.
without
It was
representation.
imposed without their consent. They didn't have a choice in it.
Okay.
Taxation without representation.
I like taxation without representation before historical context, though, because that comes more with the Boston Tea Party. This is before that time, just by like a year or two, so we're not really,
It's like starting to question like the English government.
that's kind of what I was looking for. I put the extent of the king's power in the colonies, right? So we have what king's power in colonies, right? So like, to what extent can the British monarchy dictate the lives of the people in the colonies? And also with topics, you want to keep it short, you want to keep it brief, just something that's a broad overview, things like that. All right, it's not very relevant. All right, but when was it?
1907.
1907?
1761.
It's 1765. When you look at the document, it's in the parentheses right by the title. That's where you're gonna get the majority of your dates. Also could be in the early context section as well. All right, where was it? We already mentioned this before, but
Virginia.
Virginia. And specifically, what part of Virginia?
Richmond.
Jamestown, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so historical context, like I mentioned earlier, like Crystal mentioned earlier, that idea of taxation without Okay, so this idea that was formed from the Sons of Liberty and the Boston Tea Party, right? They're basically saying, hey, if we can't make a name for ourselves in legislation, why can't y'all tax us, right? So we're not gonna abide by your rules anymore. We're gonna start our own body of government, our own forms of, like our own form of like life, right, in the colonies, of which they have already established, but now the monarchy is imposing new ways of life upon them, right? So this whole idea, of course, it comes later. I think in 1767 through 70s, right? This fuels the American Revolution, right? We see this is the main sort of argument for the Declaration of Independence. You know, we the people. You know, we want liberties and freedoms. Comes from this idea, right? This taxation without representation. W/O stands for without. That's my shorthand for it. All right, audience. What is this document, or who is this document talking to? Sorry. Why do you say that?
Cause he keeps saying, majesties, liege, or people.
He is, when he says majesty, liege, and people, he is referring to the people in, Britain and the monarchy, but he's referring to who is imposing the things upon them.
The governor.
Exactly, he's talking about the government and what they're imposing onto him, but he's not talking to the government. He's talking to anybody?
Colonists?
Yep. And what are you gonna say, Faith?
I was just confused because in the description of this document, it says Virginia's House of Burgesses approved 4 resolutions offered by the fiery orator Patrick Henry. So I didn't know about that. Was that like, I didn't know if that was.
Patrick Henry is another advocate, another politician,
Okay.
another lawyer, one of those made activists at this time. This idea of taxation without representation, right? This activist saying hey, Britain can't do that. So he's part of that government, that body of government. But going back to what Brianna said, right? The audience is the colonies, right? It's the people, it's the citizens that are being affected by the government and the monarch, or the government of the monarch.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that was, because it says the source was John Pendleton Kennedy, but in the description it doesn't explain who he is, and normally before the document they explain who it is sort of, so I didn't know who it was that was saying this, or writing this.
Mainly when it has the who in the source area, that's the person who wrote it, so it's the one who knows the most about it, right? So the person that made the laws, and the verbiage of the laws could be what was his name?
Patrick Henry?
Yeah, Patrick Henry. It could be him. He's the one who's making those laws and showing them to the government. But it's John Pendleton who is the one that is writing about the laws and basically displaying them out. If that makes sense.
Okay.
Okay. So audience, it's colonies / citizens. Affected. Right, so it's the colonies and citizens affected by the monarchy's taxation, right? This new, the Stamp Act, the new imposition of, hey, everything that you get, we're putting a tax to it, right? So that's sort of who these laws apply to, because the laws are stating hey, you guys don't have to listen to what they're saying. We make our own rules here. They can't dictate our lives, and that's not going to the monarchy, because you're not going to tell the monarchy hey, no, this doesn't apply. You're telling the citizens, don't listen. We don't need to listen, right? We dictate ourselves. All right, lens, sort of what is a theme you can place these this argument under? And potential themes you could have: social, economical, political, geographical, ethical, societal, even though that kind of considers as social. Gershwell, yeah.
John Kennedy's not alive at the time that the Stamp Act is occurring, but Patrick Henry is.
That's what I was confused about, I wanted to make sure, because I'm pretty sure Patrick Henry is the one that's stating all of this, and John Pendleton Kennedy isn't born until 30 years after this was written.
But Patrick Henry would be alive.
Oh.
That's why she said 1907, that's what she was confused
Yeah,
about.
no, I see what you're saying. I missed that completely. So, okay, so this is,
So that would be Patrick Henry. then.
yeah, okay.
Yes.
So, basically everything we said about John Kennedy, imagine that being Patrick Henry, right? I completely skipped over that 1907 part.
Change lawyer to attorney though,
No, you're good.
Okay.
and then you're good. And planter, because an attorney and a planter. Yeah, this was a planter.
that is a good example of always going back and double checking and rereading things. Cause like even me, I made a mistake, right? I didn't see that 1907 there. So like going back and rereading some things can definitely help you and see like, hey, I didn't understand this fully, or hey, I could have looked at this differently. Now I have new fresh eyes on it, right? So, but back to like the who, right? So Patrick Henry, he was the wealthy, educated politician, right? Attorney. He's the one making the laws. And the John Pendleton, 1907, I would imagine this is like his rendition and like he's elaborating it.
He was an American novelist.
Okay, so there he goes. So
Maybe he edited it?
exactly, maybe you made it into like current language and looked at verbiage and stuff, so like now we can analyze it and understand it, right? So like just going back in that process and be like, all right, let me do some research, let me fact check, let me do things like that. And that was on me. I should have double checked, but I was no rushing when I was doing these, so I wasn't really being diligent. But that's another example. Don't rush when you do this. Pay attention, make sure you're going through it and you're understanding everything, or you're gonna make simple mistakes and you may miss something on the quiz, right? Okay, so Lynn's, any Lynn's ideas?
Informal? Or informational, not informal.
What do you mean by information?
Like he's like telling the people or his audience, the colonists, like, I don't know, like how to, like what was passed and stuff, and what it means for them.
Okay. So like educational in a sense? Okay. Faith?
I was gonna say governmental, like.
Political. Yeah.
Political.
Political. What else? All right.
Choices?
Well, there's social, economical, geographical.
Probably social.
In what sense?
In the sense that they're bringing people together about this stamp tax and how it's going against some of their rights.
Are they really bringing people together, or are they
But they're
informing
just making
people?
more people angry at the king, basically.
I would say that's more like what Brianna said, educational, right? They're informing people because a lot of people may not know what's going on, right? So they may be like, hey, what's this tax? What is going on? Now we have laws that are stating, hey, this is not right. They're imposing taxes on us when they shouldn't, right? And also what you want to do is sort of like look at things from that perspective, right? So like we have educational. What you could think of is the major thing I think comes to my mind right now is like in the future, how does sort of works of government get out to the citizens, right? You see a lot of newspapers, you see a lot of sort of like scholarly type articles, like Brutus, for example. It's an anti-federalist paper that goes against the making of a constitution because they didn't want a strong central government. So we see Brutus and like those papers being released in New York to sort of oppose these constitutional views. That's educating the citizens around them. So they're like, hey, I didn't think of this before. Okay, wait, I'm getting something new, I'm learning something new. So that's where you get that educational sense. Political, look at it through a political lens, right? You can ask questions like, how does this start the early workings of a government? We see that this is the first body of government in the colonies. How does that evolve, right? We see, okay, Articles of Confederation, first major constitution of the Americas when they become the sort of the United States, right? And so you look at it through that, you look at it a lens, like how can this document relate to other things that are going on around this time, or also going back to historical context, right? How did they relate taxation without representation into the Constitution, right? We see that the Articles of Confederations, they couldn't tax anybody, right? They wanted to have that sort of like that you're being able to represent it, but we're not gonna have this big tax thing. But then we can see that's the downfall of the Articles of Confederation. So when it came to wartime, when there was a rebellion, they couldn't bring up an army to defeat them. And so they're like, hey, we need to rework the Articles of Confederation now. Now we have the Constitution, right? So you can see sort of the evolvement of government, right? So we start off with the House of Burgesses, then we get into the bicameral system, right? The House of Representatives, the Senate, right? You see this evolution, the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, right? We see this evolution of government. Look at it, that's what the lens is. It's to look at the broader picture. And this is gonna be very important when you do your primary module, right? So you wanna have that sort of lens when you're looking, when you're analyzing the primary sources you have and how you can relate it to the main topic you're talking about. All right, we kind of addressed it a little bit, but what is the argument of this document?
That the colony, like, should have the ability to speak, like, to vote and decide politically for themselves rather than just being ruled over by the British government.
So though it is a later concept, but essentially, right, so going back to the historical context, right, this is the beginning of this formation of this idea, right? The beginning to, hey, we need to have our say. If we don't have our say, you don't get to dictate us. And I already addressed that a couple of times. But yeah, so this is kind of the process you want to go to when you're analyzing these documents, so you can get more in depth and you can see things that stand out and things that may be potential questions on the quizzes. The major things I would focus on: source, who. Those two things, along with sort of your what and your argument, are the main things you kind of want to focus on, because those are things that get brought up in questions on the quiz. Historical context, audience, lens, those are more for your analysis and more for when you have to write your own analysis on the primary document. But it is good to have those in as well, because you start getting used to that idea of, hey, I have to look out for these things. All right, we're on to the next document.